Good morning, everybody. Uh, Today we are going to have the continuation of the presentation of Ravi on Bhakti Movement in North India, uh, which he started in the last month study circle. Today he is going to talk more about it and also explain uh, its consequences of Bhakti Movement in North India after 1800 or so. So, Ravi, please request you to make your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Bhargav. Let me share the screen. Okay, so last time we had a very brief sketch of Bhakti Era in North India, which was the time period we took was from 1400 to 1400 to 1700. Today we will talk mostly about the legacy of Bhakti Era, starting from 18th century till now. Just to remind you of what we discussed last time, the summary. This slide is from last time. We saw that Bhakti movement in North India, the period of those 400 years or so, or 300 years, starting with 15th century, it arose. There were four basic sources or components that fed into its evolution. First and foremost, it arose in a way against Tantrism, which was prevalent in the centuries between 7th and 11th century or so. So although Tantrics too had devotional elements, bhakti elements in their theology and practice, Bhakti in North India at least, basically it arose in opposition to Tantrism. And when it became the dominant stream, Bhakti became the dominant stream in the religious social arena, by then, it's not that Tantrism had been eliminated or defeated. Tantrism, many elements of Tantrism, especially Nath yogis and so on, were incorporated into the larger Bhakti stream. And especially in the Nirguna stream, of Bhakti movement, contained important elements. A large shadow of Tantrism was there on many of the Nirguna streams of the Bhakti movement. Then the second source was the Vedantic Bhakti Marg, largely Vaishnavite, and this had greater impact on the Saguna stream. The third element, which came a little later after Islam came to India, was Sufism, starting from 12th, 13th centuries or so. This also fed into the Bhakti Era, Bhakti movement. And of course, we talked also about the vernacular revolution, because Bhakti movement, if we accept it as a movement, even though it is a very large phenomenon, so it was not one movement and one trajectory, but still this term is quite popular in dealing with the Bhakti Era. So one important aspect of Bhakti movement was the vernacular poetry. Basically, Bhakti movement was carried by the by the saint poets, who wrote poetry, who sang it, who walked, from area to area, village to village, and they were the pioneers and they were the prophets of Bhakti movement, and all their poetry was done in the local languages. So in North India, Bhakti movement, as I think was largely true in South India too. In North India, a little later than South India, Bhakti movement also gave rise to vernacular revolution, and in turn, vernacular revolution fed into the Bhakti movement. So we will take the aftermath. For the aftermath, Bhargav was pointing out that aftermath happens only, is used, after some disasters. I don't really mean that, but still, the impact of Bhakti movement after its golden period was over, or after the period of poets and saints was over. Till today, we will talk about, and of course, our last discussion was also very sketchy. And this too will be very sketchy because we are covering large period of history and a very large phenomenon. So basically, our discussion will be confined to some very broad points. So what I have called aftermath, this 1700 to 2000, till today, starting in 1700 or so, the era of great saint poets of North India, which had started in Delhi Sultanate in the 13th century or so, more or less came to an end by 1700, when the Mughal Empire began to decline and disintegrate. So that's the period we will start with. You can roughly remember, death of Aurangzeb, which happened in 1707. After that, we are going to the period that started with that. We are going to talk about that. The Bhakti era left a deep impact on the Indian society, and the weave of social cultural mind of North India, actually maybe in the whole of India, is largely the work of Bhakti era. This aftermath continues till today. Okay, I forgot to mention one thing in the morning. I will continue in English. I will try to speak slowly, and mostly I will follow the slides, what the text that is there. I hope it will be okay with Hindi walas. And if there are any problem of language, or if there is any need for clarification, we can do that in Hindi in the discussion part. So while I am going through these slides, I will not translate into Hindi because I am not very good at translating. I start saying something else. So this aftermath continues till today. This period of 1700 to 2000 can be divided roughly into 4 successive periods. The period of 1700 to 1850 or so, till the full consolidation of British Empire in India. This period can be called the period of successor states. Successor states is the term used for many kingdoms that arose as Mughal Empire shrank and disintegrated. So the states that arose, the kingdoms that arose, those are known as successor states. That period is from 1700 to 1850 or so. Then the second period is when British Empire in India was fully consolidated, roughly 1850 to 1947, but I have put it 1905 because, after the period after 1905, I will include in the nationalist movement, which will be the third period, 1905 to 1947. And the independent India is 1947 to present. And all this we are discussing, we are not going to follow the history of these periods. That's not our topic today. We are saying what kind of impact did Bhakti movement had with various political and historical developments through these phases. And we will concentrate mostly on the first two periods, the successor states and the British Empire. The other two periods, national movement and independent India, we have partly discussed in the historical context in past, and we will discuss hopefully in future in this study circle when we talk about modern India and what kind of future we visualize for it, when we get back to that topic, But for Bhakti impact, I will basically concentrate on these two periods from 1700 to beginning of the 20th century. So the first period of what I have called aftermath, decline of Mughal Empire began after Aurangzeb, who died in 1707. The political landscape went through rapid fragmentation during the 18th century, paving the way for East India Company and to the eventual consolidation of the British Empire in India. This was I have already said it, this was the period of successor states, successors to the Mughal Empire. And I showed you last time this map in which you see the political fragmentation of North India, and this map shows only the major kingdoms in post Aurangzeb India. This does not do justice to the fragmentation because the fragmentation was a lot more. These are the major parts, but the political domination or political control of any of these kingdoms was not uniform in the area which was under their control, under their rule. So there were various, other smaller kingdoms and feudal lords and so on. I have added one more map this time, which I have taken from Susan Bailey's book, one of the volumes of New Cambridge History of India. And only thing I will ask you to take note is that I hope you are able to see these black square dots, you see spread all over, These black square dots are the capitals of various kingdoms. So you see how many, the Mughal Empire, which was whatever the entire India that you have in the map was Mughal Empire by and large. Very little, just the southern tip was never made. Very southern tip, southern part of Kerala and Tamil Nadu today. They were not part of the Mughal Empire, but entire subcontinent was. And you see how many centers of power have arisen, during 18th century. So what are the major developments that we have to keep in mind, if we want to see how Bhakti impacted in this period? So obviously what I have mentioned already, political fragmentation. But this was also the period, very interestingly, this was also the period in which settled agriculture expanded, and peasantry, peasant economy got consolidated. This is worth mentioning because generally, at least I had the impression that whatever is settled agriculture in India was more or less completed, during the Mughal times, and peasantry was already consolidated in the Mughal times, which I am not disputing in this point. That also happened in Mughal times, but historians say, or at least some historians say, that the expansion of settled agriculture really got accelerated in 18th century when the grip of the imperial grip of the Mughals, loosened, and many kingdoms and feudal lords, their domination arose, fragmented political scenario arose. Then peasantry consolidated itself more. And the third point you see there was also a big further push to deforestation. Deforestation of the subcontinent has gone through more or less continuously all the time, but through large spurts in certain periods, and those periods were, for example, in the classical era, Gupta Empire and its aftermath, that was a period, very big push of deforestation and pushing the tribal and native communities, that was the first large scale push. Maybe the first large scale push was even before Christ, but the empires facilitate large scale operations, so that happened at that time. In the Mughal era also it happened, but this period, which is often seen as political fragmentation, decline, not much happening, that kind of image one gets, at least I had that image, is far from truth. A lot was happening at the social economic level in India in this period, which was politically fragmented. And this expansion of settled agriculture and consolidation of peasantry, and aided by further deforestation, that was a very major phenomenon of this period. And this is important for our consideration because we will see that peasantry, the settled peasantry, consolidated peasantry, played a big role in absorbing the after effects of classical Bhakti era, original Bhakti era. And we will see how the social religious scene, the background to Bhakti continued expansion of effect of Bhakti in North India, was aided by this consolidation of peasantry and settled agriculture. So that is what is indicated in the fourth point, which is consolidation of caste identities, and within the caste hierarchy, the struggle for mobility. So as caste identities were not as hardened as we experience today, but as we will see later, it is also not the case that hardening of caste identities happened through the British manipulations, or through in the British era alone. Hardening of caste identities is not primarily a contribution of the British. That was happening before that, and it happened largely in the 18th century, at least in North India, where there was a lot of social turbulence economically and socially. And the people who were being absorbed into peasantry, they were kind of struggling to find their place and struggling to find relatively higher and higher place in the caste hierarchy. So this process of hardening or consolidation of caste identities, along with the struggle to gain height in that hierarchy, relative height in that hierarchy, that gave that a churning of the North Indian society was taking place along these lines in the 18th century. This happened, and now we explicitly come to the role of Bhakti era. The way this social churning and this social transformation absorbed the impact of Bhakti movement was that in the social economic conditions of settled agriculture and largely consolidated peasantry, it was no longer the era of roving saints, traveling saints singing, to singing poetry to the masses and in praise of lords, in praise of avatars. They too now settled into temples, took various forms of sects, and monasteries, from which they started operating in the villages and in general in North India of consolidated peasantry. So in a way, Bhakti gets institutionalized and ritualized because in temples, then when temple worship dominates, then temples develop their own rituals and so on. And each of these sects also developed their procedures and rituals of worship and deliberations and so on. So it got institutionalized and ritualized in this century into temples, sects, and monasteries. Nirguna stream was more confined to sects and gurus and monasteries. The Saguna stream was more successful in winning over the masses. And one of the key parts of this century's development was that Brahmin hegemony makes a comeback, which has receded in the medieval period, to some extent. Brahmin hegemony, by that I mean the Brahmin hegemony of the classical era, for example, the Gupta period and so on, that had receded for nearly a millennium or something. That makes a comeback because Brahmins begin to preside over rituals. Rituals take over the society, and Brahmins begin to preside over the rituals. And the upstart royalty, in the aftermath of disintegration of Mughal Empire, many kingdoms, big and small, are coming up. And especially the smaller ones, the aspiring kings, who were earlier not kings, but now they want to become kings, they especially needed legitimacy, and Brahmins, as in the past, played a role in providing legitimacy to this upstart royalty. Along with that, the second much larger phenomena was also taking place in peasantry, which I am using the word Sanskritization, which came to use in 20th century. M.N. Srinivas was probably the originator of this term. By Sanskritization, one means that one tries to move up in the caste hierarchy by imitating those people who are already high in the caste hierarchy. So the Savarnas or upper castes, by imitating their practices and their rituals and to some extent, their ways of life, by imitating that, the lower castes try to gain a higher location in the caste hierarchy and some dignity for themselves. This process also, because the peasantry was getting consolidated, but it was getting consolidated through churning, through social churning. Caste identities, as I said, were not as hardened as you see them today. So this was a period where, in the midst of this churning, lot of struggle was going on, and one of the struggle to gain height in the caste hierarchy. And so peasantry was engaged in this process, which was later described as Sanskritization. So in a way, through all this, you can see that Bhakti, in a way, was, it did both. It co-opted the Brahminical orthodoxy into it. Brahminical orthodoxy and ritualism became part of the Bhakti stream. And in turn, Brahminical orthodoxy and ritualism gained ground. So it was, again, Brahmins came to kind of preside over a lot of, at least the Saguna Bhakti stream, which had earlier, which had been pioneered by traveling saints, who wrote poetry. That now so you see, I mean, I hope you are able to visualize how Bhakti is changing its character. Bhakti is changing its personality. Now it is temple-based. Now it is divided into sects and monasteries. Now it is ritualistic, and Brahmins come to preside over it. Now it is used to gain higher ground in the caste hierarchy, and Brahminical orthodoxy, not only Brahmins, I mean, but I mean, I don't mean it caste-wise. The earlier classical Brahminical orthodoxy and ritualism comes to dominate the Bhakti era, which in a very large measure had arisen against this Brahminical orthodoxy. So you see, this happens over and over again in the history, in many parts of history in India. And it is very clear in the Bhakti history of North India that whatever it rises against, it co-opts that, it accommodates that, and whatever it rises against, that becomes part of it. So as in the first slide I showed you, Tantra, it started against Tantra, and Tantra largely became part of Bhakti movement, and so on. So this happens over and over again in our history. Since I am just, in order to keep within bounds of time, I am going to, I have just bullet points in my slide. So what I have done is, I have taken some quotes from the historians, from whom some of the historians that I have learned from, in order to hopefully show you that I am not making things up. This is something that I have learned from historians, and some paragraphs I have taken from these historians. So you will see why I am summarizing things that way. This is one paragraph from a book by C.A. Bailey, which is the volume 2, part 1 of New Cambridge History of India. The book is called Indian Society and the Making of British Empire. I will just read it, even though it is in front of you. Developments in the religious practices of the ordinary townsmen and country people are most difficult to chart for the 18th century. Among Hindus, the devotional or bhakti cults appear to have maintained the popularity they achieved in the preaching phase of the previous 2 centuries. So you see what he called preaching phase of previous 2 centuries, that is what we are saying the golden period of Bhakti movement in North India. Ordinary people became followers of the popular cults associated with the Rama and Krishna cults of North India. Based on towns such as Vrindavan, Ayodhya, and Mathura, devotional religion was spread through the medium of the developing Hindi language, popular festivals, and popular art. Local warfare seems to have enhanced the popularity of these cults. And this is important. Notice, we think that Bhakti movement was very full of bhakti and love and devotion and peace and whatnot. See this sentence. Local warfare seems even to have enhanced the popularity of these cults and the ascetic orders associated with them. Ascetics such as Gosais and Bairagis had forged themselves into powerful armed brotherhoods. They were also able to accumulate large quantities of capital because of their corporate organization. These monasteries had their armies, and they even today, if you come to some parts of UP, these monasteries have their armies. They were also able to accumulate large quantities of capital because of their corporate organization. Peasants and farmers looked to them for protection and finance in adversity, and even donated their children to them in times of famine. In the same way, the deification by ordinary Hindu and tribal peoples of 18th century, Muslim and Hindu warriors, speaks of Muslim and Hindu, 18th century Muslim and Hindu warriors. You know, there are these folklores in eastern part of UP. You know, for example, Ghazi Mian, you know, one young Muslim Sufi, you know, who was also a warrior and who died at the age of 18 or 19, something like that. You know, there are folk songs in praise of Ghazi Mian in eastern, you know, in our areas, and there are many Hindu warriors too, local Hindu warriors too, which are sung about. They were parts of this ascetic, you know, sects and monasteries. So in the same way, the deification by ordinary Hindu and tribal peoples, deification of 18th century Muslim and Hindu warriors, speaks again of the capacity of ordinary Hindus to incorporate into their belief an imaginative world dangerous forces from outside. How people who are common peasants, you know, common grihasthas, you know, themselves will not think of, you know, violence or anything. They are very subdued, you know. They adopt, you know, they accommodate, they sing praises to dacoits, to, you know, chieftains, to small local warriors. And in that period, you know, the monasteries, the ascetic monasteries, which derived from the Bhakti streams, they also contributed to these Robin Hoods, these Muslims and Hindu warriors, and they were the private local army of these monasteries. So this paragraph I wanted to quote to give you a flavor of what the way we are looking at this century, 18th century, is not something that we are making it up. The second quote I have taken from Susan Bailey. And this is another Bailey. In fact, she was wife of C.A. Bailey. And she has written another volume in that series, you know, that is more, that her book is more on caste, you know, but it deals with the same period. In fact, she names her chapter 2, which the period of 1700 to 1830 as Brahmin Raj. The time of kings and the service people. In service people includes the priests and Brahmins, and as well as, you know, these warriors, and as well as peasantry, you know. So the book's name is Caste, Society and Politics in India from 18th century to the modern age. So the quotation is, in this period then, this is different Bailey. It's, you know, she is the wife of C.A. Bailey, but doesn't mean that, you know, they are the same. They are independent scholars, you know. In this period, we can certainly see some signs of the very different India that was to emerge by the end of 19th century. As early as the 1820s, Brahmins and those who admired the norms of a pure and pacific Brahmin-centered way of life had become extremely prominent in many parts of India. And here she is talking about how caste hierarchy was changing shape, you know. So when she is saying pacific, pure and pacific Brahmin-centered way of life, she is contrasting it with the Rajput or the kingly way of life, which was a lot more conflictual and violent, you know. So it had become extremely prominent in many parts of India. This had occurred initially through preferment and economic success under indigenous realms like that of the Peshwas. Now she is talking about the turn of the century, you know, beginning of 19th century. So in Peshwas, you know, Peshwa rule was an example of where Brahmin dominance came to fore. It was then sustained through the apparently contradictory experiences of being first disparaged, then tamed and exalted under the British-sponsored Hindu kingdoms, and in the legal codes that were created for company-ruled territories in the early 19th century. So you see how the scene was changing. In the previous code, we saw that, the rough and tumble of 18th century, and now this one is being, somewhat being systematized and settled into when the East India Company is already has already gained ground in large parts of North India. The same quote continues, after a few paragraphs. The expansion of commerce and cash cropping also gave important advantages to many trading and non-elite peasant groups. These were the people who sometimes favored conventional Brahman-centered piety, but who were also often attracted to sectarian faiths like those of the Swaminarayan. The same Swaminarayan that is, from Gujarat, it originated in 18th, 19th century. I don't exactly remember, maybe early 19th century. In either case, such people were beginning to be active at this time in the forging of what we would now call caste Hindu lifestyles. The Sanskritization. Peasantry was getting Sanskritized. And here too, we can see the expansion of conventions which were implicitly hostile to the values and skills of the lordly men of prowess, and even more inimical to the ways of life of the forest and pastoral groups with whom the arms-bearing proprietary groups were often closely associated. So she is contrasting the role of these sects, influenced by Bhakti stream and so on, and the role of Brahmins, and she is contrasting with the politically dominant castes of earlier, the propertied caste, which were largely also the ruling castes, Rajputs and so on. And that scenario was also changing. So if we kind of, partly repetition, but, I just want to keep things in perspective. So the way Bhakti mutated, the way it changed, in the society at large, how can that be summarized? So one, Nirguna stream settles into sects and monasteries and becomes confined to them. Move this, I cannot. Supported by followers, as well as it accumulates its own resources, including landed property. So Nirguna is more confined. It doesn't have that much of its mass influence is shrinking. Like Kabir Panthis and so on. Saguna stream gains mass following, especially sects like Ramanandis, who worshipped Ram and took Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas practically to every household. Worshipping at temples, ritualistic practices, and religious festivals became the dominant forms of Saguna Bhakti. And I also can mention here that, the Ramanandis who popularized, Ram Bhakti, devotion to Ram and worship of Ram, in many parts of North India, they also were organized. They had organized armies, organized gangs, at their behest. And when I was mentioning of Gosais and Bairagis, who were armed and who peasantry often sought their protection, Ramanandis were not far behind. They also had, similar arrangements. I am mentioning this because, Ramanand is almost a mythical figure in North India. Not only he is seen as he was probably in 14th century, his life, actually his period is not very well established, but he is considered a guru to Kabir, to Raidas, and even to Tulsidas. All of that could not have happened because they were somewhat apart. Unless he lived for 200 years or something, he could not have been direct gurus of all of them, But he is seen as a devotional figure, promoting devotion to Ram, and I I think, okay. Later on, if I find time, I will quote a Rabindranath poem to Ramanand and Raidas, their encounter. I meant to include this in the slides, but I have forgotten, I think. Anyway, so this these Ramanandis were pious and devotional and all that, but when needed, they were ready to battle too. The Bhakti stream becomes embedded and implicated in the social churning. Third point, the Bhakti stream becomes embedded and implicated in the social churning and emerging structures in the century of successor states, which has also been dubbed as the century of peasants and Brahmins. Okay, I have already talked about it. Bhakta sects and monasteries acquire land and social power. I am just summarizing. I have said all these things before. Accumulate property and wealth, adjudicate and resolve social conflicts. Some even raise armed mercenary bands which offer protection to peasants and communities. And lastly, the Saguna stream, with its spread to the masses, opens the door of the society at large for Brahminical orthodoxy through temple worship, rituals, and through processes of Sanskritization, in which the peasantry strives to acquire a better status in the emerging and consolidating caste hierarchy. None of the points are new. I have already said that, but I wanted to put it in one slide. Now, certain comments. Notice that Bhakti on the ground and in reality was very different from how it has been imagined by many who think that it signifies, Bhakti is, mainly signifies spirituality, plurality, many paths to the God, tolerance, which means, all these sects and all these streams, tolerant to each other, and faith as a way of life as opposed to organized religion. This makes Bhakti very dear to many streams of theorists, and political ideologues and so on, including, we will later come to Gandhi as well as the postmodernists. Secondly, also note that consolidation of, as I have already said, consolidation of caste system and of the traditional Hindu society was far from being a handiwork of the British colonialism. Often, many theorists and historians point out that caste, is British creation. At least the hardened caste identity is a British creation, because they started the census of the population and they started counting how many people belong to which castes and so on. And all this, the Foucauldian terminology of governmentality, where the government, the state, begins to shape the people, to make them governable. The technologies of governance shapes people. That is known as governmentality. And all this, many of the things are put at the doors of the British. Many of the problems of our, social problems of our society. But if you really, are careful and, honest to yourself, you are not too much driven to accuse the British of everything, then you will see that many of the things were happening before the British consolidated themselves. Many of the things were happening in the period during the Mughal Empire and after the Mughal Empire and before the British came. So if anything, it happened, this consolidation of caste system and traditional Hindu society, that happened mostly during the century of the successor states. And lastly, like most phenomena in the Indian history, I have already talked about it, but I have again noted it. The journey of Bhakti is contradictory, it is adaptive and amalgamative. Whatever it rises against, it accommodates that later. Rebels against caste hierarchy and Brahminical orthodoxy become adjudicators and protectors of hierarchy and orthodoxy. Remember rituals, temples, and so on. Earlier, Bhakti, the earlier examples I have already mentioned, earlier Bhakti had started out in opposition to Tantrism, but later co-opted it. It was inspired by Sufism and collaborated with it, but later, as we will see in the later half of 19th century, later got roped into the formation of a Hindu identity, which was opposed to Islam and which was instrumental in spurring communalism. We will see that in later half of 19th century. So in actual history of the Bhakti movement is very different from its textual literary history and often contrary to many of the theoretical expectations and generalizations. And this is something, as I have been mildly, to some extent, educating myself on this part of history, it strikes me, I come from Hindi area, and hopefully we will later get a chance to discuss, the way Bhakti is talked about by Hindi literateurs, critics, and so on. It is mostly textual literary history, and there is very little that gets talked about in what kind of society it arose and what kind of society it created. So the things that one learns from, whatever has been written by many foreign scholars and even by Indian scholars working in English, often researching and teaching while, in some university abroad, the way they write about Bhakti and the way Hindi literature people write about Bhakti, they are so different. They are so different. The Hindi, there is much more emphasis on interpreting, let us say, Kabir, and not about, the times of Kabir, even though famous books are there which will title themselves Kabir Ka Samay and all that, but there is very little about, Kabir Ka Samay, the Kabir's times, in those books, So mostly Bhakti movement, at least in the Hindi area, is seen through the textual literary lens, and even the theoretical expectations and generalization about Bhakti is more about some kind of idea of Bhakti, whatever idea a given author or investigator may have. So it is mostly the idea of Bhakti and the texts of Bhakti literature that is what gets talked about, what Bhakti has done to the society at large, and how it got roped into politics of the times, and how it mutated and changed and how it became something quite other than the idea of Bhakti, that very seldom gets talked about. So Bhakti is largely romanticized, by Hindi literatures and by many theorists and by many political ideologues. The idea of Bhakti is idealized, and actually existing, Bhakti movement in the society, the temples, the sects, the monasteries, the armies, the caste hierarchy, the Brahminical, presiding over the rituals and so on. In the larger picture of the society, what role Bhakti did play and how it got mutated, that does not get talked about. So the second phase of what I have called aftermath, the British India and the 19th century. So the consolidation of the British Empire in India brought about deep and multifaceted changes to the Indian society. For our consideration here, we need only to underline only two broad impacts. It's a large subject. Of course, people spend their lifetime researching this, these areas of, times of history. We are just, summarizing things to evaluate in the end what Bhakti movement has overall done to the Indian society and civilization. So we need, in the moving towards the modern period, we need only to underline only two broad aspects. One, encounter with modernity, and modernity I am not very accurately or precisely defining now, but in the common usage, the way it is used, I mean that. Encounter with modernity gave rise to religious, social, cultural reform movements, both on the Hindu side and on the Muslim side. And remember Brahmo Samaj of Ram Mohan Rai, Brahmo Samaj that was founded in 1828. And Ram Mohan Rai, who was born in 1772 and died in 1833, just to remind you of the time. Later, in the later half of 19th century, Arya Samaj was founded in 1875 by Dayanand Saraswati, who was born in 1824 and died in 1883. And on the Muslim side, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, a reformist, trying to bring modern education to the Muslim society, but also later on, as he grew into the idea of, he was one of the, you can say, original or founders of the idea of two-nation theory and Muslims being a separate nation. So had both the modernist aspect of reforming the Muslim movement, Muslim society, and also, what later developed into seeds of the ideas that later developed into two-nation theory. And, Brahmo Samaj of Raja Ram Mohan Rai was a kind of almost like, partly walking out of Hindu fold and yet being part of Hindu fold, that kind of thing, monotheism, learning a lot of things from Christianity and from other religions and trying to formulate, something suited to the Indian society, He was also a social reformer, his campaign against sati and all that, He was more liberal, more modern compared to Dayanand Saraswati, who was also radical, but not as modern. He also promoted monotheism, an abstract God rather than these avatars. He said that Vedas should be our original Granth. He wanted to accord the status to Vedas equivalent to Bible or Quran or something. So, but later on we will see that this kind of radical reform movement of Hinduism, like the Arya Samaj and Dayanand Saraswati, participated in a big way in the communal polarization that started in the later half of 19th century. So the first part is encounter with modernity that gave rise to religious reform movements and educational reform movements too, social reform movements too. I am making a statement or a claim. I don't have time to prove it, that this happened largely under the impact of modernity. Without whatever came, ideas that came with colonialism, came from West, without that, none of these people would have said and done what they did. And the second part was emergence of communalism and nationalism in the later half of century. So communal mobilization, both on the Hindu side and on the Muslim side, that started in the second half of 19th century, especially after 1857. Even reform movements like the Arya Samaj and the Aligarh movement contributed to it. They became part of that Hindu-Muslim, activating Hindu-Muslim divide and communalizing the social political arena. This was also the time when there was a great literary linguistic campaign to separate Hindi from Urdu. That's a very large story, how Hindi was Sanskritized and Urdu became Persianized, or Urdu was already Persianized, but Hindi was keeping the same grammar, same structure of Khadi Boli of Urdu. Hindi came to take a new avatar, which was separate from Urdu. And just to remind you, formation of Congress took place in 1885 and formation of Muslim League happened in 1906. This, I just wanted to flash this well-known map of India to you. Now the reason I am flashing it is that, look, compare it with the period of 18th century fragmentation. Now the whole of the subcontinent, in fact, for the very first time, entire subcontinent is under one rule, one empire, which is, which I am talking of, let's say around 1900, it is, or later half of 19th century, under the crown, India under the British crown. Entire India, I mean, this part, many other parts that were not part of that, how to put it, let me collect my sentences. This India does not include everything that was there in the Maurya Empire, because Maurya Empire was, went, to Afghanistan and so on, and many does not include everything that was in the Mughal Empire at its peak. But entire subcontinent, the way it is in this map, this was never fully integrated by even the largest empire of pre-British India, not the Mauryas, not the Guptas, and not the Mughals, the three large empires. There were parts, bits and pieces of India, that were still beyond those empires. So this is the largest integration of India that happened. And now we are talking about this entire thing. Even though our subject is, we are concentrating on North India because we are talking about Bhakti in North India. So what happens? Again, summarizing many of the things that I have already said. North India after 1857, modernity, public sphere, religious identities. First, in the colonial history of India and education, these two things, research into India's past. The Orientalist, started with the William Jones towards the end of 18th century, and Monier Williams and Max Muller in the middle of or later half of 19th century. These Orientalists, these people who were genuinely interested in the Indian civilization, society, and so on, and its history, and they dug up a lot of ancient literature, Sanskrit literature, and so on. And of course, they had their biases, ideologies, and so on. So they were the ones who projected India's ancient past as glorious and dubbed them mostly as Hindu period. They were the ones who dubbed the medieval period as Muslim period, and they were not too kind to that period. And of course, their own period was the British period or the modern period. So they were the ones who discovered Sanskritic glory of ancient India, and they were the ones who sowed the seeds of the idea that ancient glory was kind of despoiled, kind of destroyed by the Islamic invasion, by the Muslim invasion. So medieval period for them was corresponding to their own history, dark period. The ancient period was glorious, and of course, they were leading the modern period. So James Mill, for example, who never visited India and wrote his history sitting there in England, he periodized Indian history as Hindu, Muslim, and British eras. You have heard of Macaulay. He advocated, his own colonial English kind of education to prepare the bureaucrats and clerks, for Indians ruling for the British over India. They also established colleges and, training centers of bureaucrats and so on. So this was one major development that took place, in terms of how history of India, millennial history of India was put together, how it was divided into three periods, how it was divided along religious communal divides, and how this was being taught to people who became bureaucrats and clerks and whoever, this intelligentsia, English-speaking intelligentsia, was fed on this kind of things. And this is what many of the post-colonial critics, and even nationalist historians criticize that. I think they go too far. They blame the British and the Orientalist entirely for the communal reading of history, and they blame British only for sowing the seeds of communalism in India. Things were much more complicated than that, but there is no denying that these people contributed to that. This kind of Orientalist, researchers, many of them were genuinely interested in Indian civilization. Many of them did not have this political mission, to, as James Mill might have had. They were genuine scholars, and thanks to them, we Indians again rediscovered, those Sanskrit texts, and the literary philosophical glories of ancient India. They did genuine work. But this too is the case, that all put together, they prepared the framework of this classical Hindu period, Muslim period, and the modern period. Also, this was the century when print media and public sphere, as it is known, public sphere means, the sphere between the state and government on the one hand and family on the other, that Habermasian concept of public sphere, that arose. Newspapers, magazines, and journals started getting printed in 19th century, and in fact, they were very, it was a later half of 19th century was a thriving period, for these things. Literary movements arose, and as I said, separation of Hindu Urdu happened as a part of those literary movement and the struggles in the literary public sphere. And this gave rise to, in order to, I prepared the slides in a hurry, so I took help from, I didn't want to always concoct my own titles. So I took this title from Vasudha Dalmia's famous book, The Nationalization of Hindu Traditions. That, I think, is a quite accurate description of what happened in later half of 19th century in northern part of India. And she takes, this book is about the life and work of Bharatendu Harishchandra, who was born in 1850 and died in 1885, and who is considered the father of modern Hindi. And he was a remarkable person, very influential, a big charismatic leader, good writer, good speaker, and so on, and a big religious campaigner too. So this nationalization of Hindu traditions, I think, I have just, hurriedly put it traditionalist. What I mean by that, there were, in the 19th century, the social, religious, literary reformers or activists, you can largely categorize them, divide them in two parts. One where the quote unquote the radicals, you can say, and by in those radicals, I will put both Ram Mohan Rai as well as Dayanand Saraswati, because they wanted radical reorganizing of the Hindu society. They wanted to conceptualize Hindu religion originating from either from one source, in case of Dayanand Saraswati, from the Vedas, or in case of Ram Mohan Rai, a eclectic collection of many ideas taken from many religions. But they wanted deep plow changes into the Hindu societies. They were the radicals. Compared to them, there were the traditionalists who said that, who were very close to the Orientalists. They said that ancient Brahminical, Sanatani, Sanskritic glory was there in classical period in ancient India. which declined because of the Muslim invasion, and that needs to be recovered. The India's glory is not to be achieved through reforms, but it needs to be achieved through reclaiming the glorious past and bringing Indian society back to the ancient times. Many reformers, I shouldn't call reformers, many ideologues and activists of this kind were there, and where we will see that they were the ones who became victorious in having large mass influence by the end of 19th century and definitely in the 20th century. So I mean this term that I have called traditionalist, I should have contrasted it with the radicals like Ram Mohan Rai and Dayanand Saraswati. Even though those two, Roy and Dayanand Saraswati, were very different from each other and very opposed to each other. So the way this nationalization of Hindu traditions took place is that these traditionalists came to fore who agreed with the Orientalist glorification of Sanskritic antiquity, and they were an amalgamation of modernity, nationalism, and communalism as it evolved. I mean, the campaigns where we often talk about, large part of Congress party in the nationalist times also composed of, traditionalists mainly, Hindu traditionalists mainly. That is true. Gandhi was different, and of course Nehru was very different. But the large part of the manpower of Congress party, was traditionalist. So this amalgamation of modernity and the idea of nationalism also arose in those times. So after 1857, very paradoxically, when many of these traditionalists were agreeing with the Orientalists, the way the colonial intellectuals saw Indian history, they agreed with that, but at the same time, they also were inspired by ideas of nationalism. Bharatendu Harishchandra being an example. He was a traditionalist. He was communal. He participated very strongly in cow protection movement and so on. And but at the same time, he was nationalist too, genuinely nationalist. So he was both modern, nationalist, and communal. He is a good example of what was happening in the North Indian public sphere. And these were also the prophet and pioneers of modern Hindi. So again, I take some quote from Vasudha Dalmia to give you a flavor of that period. Now I am talking mostly of the later half of 19th century. She says, the three features which crystallized in the writings and activities of Harishchandra and his contemporaries in this period were: 1, Vaishnava monotheism as the most ancient and authentic strand of the long tradition which constituted Sanatan Dharma. So Vaishnava monotheism. These were, and they were, again, we will see, they included even Shaivas, according to their definition, even Shaivas could be included in Vaishnavism, believe it or not. Second, devotional bhakti as the overarching principle. This is why we are talking of these things, the impact of Bhakti movement, the aftermath of Bhakti movement. Devotional bhakti as the overarching principle which could subsume all deviating traditions, Gyan or Buddhi playing thereby only a subsidiary role. I mean, Gyan Marg or Buddhi, plays subsidiary role and is almost like a deviating tradition. Main tradition is Bhakti. Only as in the relationship to and realization of God. So devotional bhakti as the overarching principle which could subsume all deviating traditions, Gyan or Buddhi playing thereby only a subsidiary role in the relationship to and realization of God. And thirdly, finally, image worship as the central feature of Vaishnava Bhakti and as forming the one common denominator for all manner of Hindu sampradayas. This was important because there was a lot of theoretical and theological arguments, supporting Murti Puja. Murti Puja being an important part of this bhakti, importance of devotion, hegemony of devotional bhakti. And this was very important component, especially if you look at how these people were going to differentiate themselves from radicals like Ram Mohan Rai and Dayanand Saraswati. Ram Mohan Rai as being, thorough modernist and not giving as much room to either ancient Sanatan Dharma or devotional bhakti, and Dayanand Saraswati having a very vigorous campaign against Murti Puja, against image worship. So compared to that, Bhartendu and these traditionalists, like modernist traditionalists, strange as it might sound, oxymoron, modernist traditionalists, they separated themselves very clearly from the radical, as well as from Islam, as well as from Christianity. And one instrument was their argument in favor of image worship, Murti Puja. At another place, Vasudha Dalmia says, in the same book, Harishchandra brought forward a number of reasons for considering the Vaishnava religion the Prakrit Mat, natural religion of the country. Vaishnava religion being the natural religion of the country. The first was that Kabir, Dadu, Sikh, Baul, and other devotional paths were all branches of the Vaishnavas. The other reasons were of more popular nature. They cited the names of people, places, and rivers, the turns of idiom which recalled Vishnu, and the many rites and customs, the feasts and festivals which commemorated him. And they detailed the chief literary and religious works in which tales of Vishnu in one form or another dominated, namely Rama and Krishna cults and so on. If this faith were progressive, then men of other faiths, the Sikhs, Kabir Panthis, and other groupings of Hindu Gana, the Hindu peoples, would join in. They are saying that if we are not too sectarian, too progressive, if we are accommodative, all other sects, Sikhs, Kabir Panthis included, they will join the Vaishnavite path, Vaishnava path. And this would provide further evidence that Vaishnavism was the Prakrit Mat of the country. It was not the time to insist on outward compliance, much more Antarik, Unnat, Premamai Bhakti. Bhakti which was progressive, internally felt, and filled with love. This was to be propagated. A few pages down the line in the same book, she goes on to say, the main characteristics of the true religion of the Hindus could then, for the time being, be defined in a manner which most suited the public image, which drew the most support from the traditionalist groupings as well as from Western Orientalists. These main characteristics were monotheism and devotion to personal God, and these were, for all the marginalization of Shiva, broad enough to represent the Shaivas as well as the Vaishnavas. It was this broad-based position that coined the face of modern Hinduism rather than the iconoclasm of more radical reformers such as the Brahmo and the Arya Samaj, which served rather as catalyzing agents. So they did not really directly frontally attack Brahmo Samaj or Arya Samaj. They always took the path of accommodating and being nice to everything that could be part of the Hindu world. But there was collusion even with these when it came to shutting out popular forms of worship, which were henceforth to be branded as superstition. So on the other side, they were also worried about the folk religions, local folk religions, because they had to organize on a national basis one religious arena, which was different from the radicals, which was obviously different from Islam and other religions, but which was also not like folk religion that they were they were trying to do. So part of the goal was same as the Arya Samaj, because Arya Samaj also wanted to organize Hindus in the form of an organized religion which worshipped abstract God, which did not believe in avatars, which did not do Murti Puja, and which resembled more like, the big religions, the big world religions like Christianity and Islam. These people, the traditionalists like Bharatendu, were different from Arya Samaj, but their goals were similar. They wanted to organize the Hindu society under the umbrella of religion as well as nationalism. Harishchandra's response could be considered as representative of a wider trend in the construction of the Hindu religious tradition of northern India. As a leading publicist, speaking with the authority of the holy city of Kashi and its institutions, with a massive reputation in the world of Hindi letters, Harishchandra obviously not only represented, but also created public opinion. That imprint of Harishchandra is there in the Hindi public sphere even today. Then we quickly go over, this was the 9th century. That was, so the 18th century and 19th century is my main concern today. I will quickly go over the 20th century to make some final comments and conclude. Bird's eye view of 20th century. The Hindu traditionalists, nationalists, and communalists in the Congress and outside, Vivekananda, Aurobindo Ghosh, Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, Hindu Mahasabha, Savarkar, RSS, all these people together. They were all different from each other. Some were more traditionalists, some were more nationalists, and some were out and out communalists. They held a great impact on early 20th century. Muslim communalism and Muslim League also emerged in the same period. Examples, major examples who influenced the first half of 20th century, including the national movement, were Tagore, who was more into spiritual part of Bhakti for tolerance, and he was an internationalist while keeping a Hindu soul. Gandhi was the most dominant figure. He influenced everything, and he was, in fact, the only one who was true representative and advocate of the idea of Bhakti. I should have put in the word there, idea of Bhakti, which meant, actual Bhakti was very different from the idea of Bhakti as we have seen in 18th century and 19th century. So Gandhi was completely honest to the original idea of Bhakti of the saint poets, of the, medieval times, 15th, 16th, 17th century, which included tolerance, syncretism, pluralism, spiritualism, and plebeianism, people's way of life and so on. Utopian about future of Indian civilization. At the same time, Gandhi was utopian. How would these ideas and ideals that he subscribed to, how would they survive in future? That required a romantic view of the future of Indian civilization, which will be collection of village republics, folk ways of life, and religion being, all those things, tolerant, syncretic, plural, spiritual, and so on. Nehru, of course, another tall figure of 20th century, was thoroughly modernist. He was secular in the standard sense of the word. He was liberal, but he was at the same time sympathetic both to Tagore and Gandhi, their ideas. Ambedkar, he looked at the entire Indian civilization, its entire history, role of Bhakti included, through the caste lens, he presented the caste critique of Hinduism. And left was also an important component of the political ideological movement in the nationalist era, But only comment I want to make, it's a large subject, but only comment relevant for our topic of discussion now is that they did not seriously engage with the civilizational makeup of India and the peculiarity of Indian society. They were indifferent. They had an indifferent attitude to Bhakti. They had no problem with it because people had no problem with Bhakti. But at the same time, they had to navigate between their ideology and their practice, and they had to navigate also between atheism and populism. And the independent India, quickly, many of us have often talked about it. I have just put it for completeness sake. Bird's eye view. Nehru, Ambedkar, they started out the republic, modern secular constitution and republic, welfare state, something resembling it, welfare state, social emancipation, civic nationalism, all citizens, nationalism of the citizens, I mean, all citizens being equal constitutionally, legally. So civic nationalism, representative democracy, and the period of Congress hegemony in the political arena. This you can say basically the Nehru period of independent India. Then came the interregnum, the Indira Rajiv period, up to the Babri destruction, slow decline of Congress hegemony, pressure of competitive electoral democracy increases, and Congress makes compromises with communalism. And the third, ascendance of Hindutva through competitive electoral democracy and Hindu majoritarianism. That is the period we are living under. So Bhakti has mutated through the last 2 centuries and synthesized, articulated, and deployed into the politics by traditionalist, communal, conservative, nationalist ideologues. Remember, Bharatendu Harishchandra has won the day. Their influence is predominant. And the spiritual, tolerant, pluralist bhaktas, remember Gandhi, have lost. For now, the modernist, liberal secularists, remember Nehru, have lost too. They appear to have lost too, even though they might make a comeback. Let us see what happens on 4th of June. So, yeah. So then we quickly come to some conclusion. Not quickly. I hope to have more discussion in the discussion part. I don't know how much time I have taken. I have taken an hour and a half, close to an hour and 20 minutes. So quickly, how to assess the legacy of Bhakti Era? And these are points that are partly polemical too, because in democracy dialogue we have had many speakers, nationalist kind, post-colonial kind, Gandhian kind, postmodernist kind too, partly postmodernist kind who synthesize and who conceptualize faith as a way of life, like Nandi. Nandi did not speak for us, but his shadow is there even on many of the presentations without him being there. So should we recover? I mean, we are, for discussion, I am raising some points. Should we recover the mode of faith as a way of life? Is religion itself a Western alien concept, institution, practice? That is question 1. And that is very related to impact of Bhakti on today's theorists, ideologues, philosophers, thinkers, as well as politicians. Remember, for example, I might mention, I don't mean to criticize him right now. I admire him for his deep thinking, but still some disagreement will appear that Rajiv Bhargava, for example, said in very many words that religion as conceptualized in the modern times and in the Western world, that itself may be a problem. And there he was very close to Ashish Nandi's formulation of faith as a way of life. So I have taken a quote of Ashish Nandi here. Each religion in our part of the world, this is Ashish Nandi, each religion in our part of the world has been split into 2, faith and ideology. By faith, I mean religion as a way of life, a tradition that is definitionally non-monolithic and operationally plural. By ideology, I mean religion as a subnational, national, or cross-national identifier of populations. This is a fancy word for religious identities, emergence of religious identities. So I mean religion as a subnational, national, or cross-national identifier of populations contesting for or protecting non-religious, usually political or socio-economic interest. So he is kind of disparaging what he considers religion as ideology, and he is advocating for religion as a way of life. we have to discuss that. I mean, it is one thing to philosophize and theorize, but what has been the actual life history of Bhakti stream in northern India or whole of India? Those were the ideas, implicit in the Bhakti movement, but the way in actual history and in actually existing society, the way Bhakti progressed, why could not that pristine idea of religion as a faith and as a way of life, why could not that sustain? We have to worry about that, and we have to argue about that. Second point, how to ensure tolerance, plurality, spiritualism, syncretism in the social arena of religion. That was the expectation of Gandhi and many nationalists, including modernist nationalists like Nehru. And that is the expectation of people like Nandi and Rajiv Bhargava and many of the nationalist historians and post-colonial historians. All the communitarians, romantics, utopians, organicists, postmodernists put together have not been able to accomplish this. If Gandhi could not succeed, what can the mere mortals do? I am raising that question, that how to realize this tolerance, plurality, spiritualism, syncretism, this potential of bhakti. Third, which imaginaries become real? What are the conditions and perquisites of the emergence construction of successful social imaginaries? These some terms I am using very briefly. There are social theorists and philosophers who have come up with this idea of social imaginaries. If large enough part of a society imagines something, some identity or some idea or some concept, even though it is an imaginary thing, that becomes real. As far as society is concerned, and as far as politics is concerned, those social imaginaries become real, But the question is that which of the imaginaries? We are all free to imagine. We as individuals, as community, as group, as ideologues, as movement, as some organization, we are all free to imagine. But which imaginaries become social imaginaries? Benedict and Anderson, for example, famously defined nation as imagined political communities. But he also pointed out the conditions in which, nations emerged, nationalism emerged, print capitalism, he famously framed it, that print capitalism was behind the emergence of nationalism in the examples from Far East that he was taking as an example for his formulation. Theorists and philosophers have labored over the concept of social imaginaries functioning as real things in the constitution and the functioning of the social universe. But why do some imaginary become social while most others fail to gain that status? The legacy of Bhakti Era must be evaluated against actual history and not through the theological, textual, philosophical, literary analyses. I have already made that point, and that's a major point that I want to make, that the way Bhakti Era has been seen and has been analyzed and has been learned from, and the way it has been seen as a product of history as well as impacting on history, that analysis is largely textual, largely theological. What did the Bhakti prophets or poets say and what did they not say? What was the philosophy behind their theology? So the analysis is largely theological, textual, philosophical, and one case I am familiar with, Hindi literature, it is largely literary analysis of the text, and not a social, political, historical analysis of the entire context, So that is, I think, where I will end. Yeah, I wanted to show you this. Where is? This is a very recent photograph. I think you will recognize the photograph, I will not make any comments. I will, I will make the comment that for those of you who may not know, I don't believe anybody doesn't know, when Kanhaiya Kumar, the young, dynamic Congress leader who started his career, in Communist Party, and is in the student movement. He filed his nomination paper from one of the constituencies in Delhi, and he performed this puja as he. So I have titled it Actually Existing Democracy in an Actually Existing Society. Before you rush to denounce Kanhaiya Kumar, you should pay attention to this title that I have given, Actually Existing Democracy in an Actually Existing Society. There is one more comment I wanted to make. Okay, just bear with me for 2-3 more minutes. I also want to discuss, in future, the millennial civilizational assessment of bhakti. It is one thing to assess or evaluate bhakti in the current social political context at the scale of decades and centuries. But a quite different assessment will be needed if we want to understand bhakti on a millennial civilizational scale. And I compare this with what is known as axial revolutions. Axial revolution is a concept given by a philosopher, Karl Jaspers, and he underlined the appearance of great religions, prophets, great thinkers during the 800 to 300 BC, a remarkable period when all great prophets and all great religions arose, and the revolutionary elite, arose, and the enculturation, the transformation of the social world from above started. This was opposed to populism, and the famous examples were China of that period, India, where Buddhism, Jainism, and also Upanishads, they arose. Persia of that period, Levant, the area of Syria, Turkey, and so on. That period, the civilizational developments in that region too. And of course, the Greco-Roman world, Greece, and later the Roman Empire, These were the examples which were very different from whatever the world was like before them. And they transformed the world. This is what Jaspers called axial revolution. And the idea has been then further pursued by historical sociologists or social historians, largely influenced by Max Weber, often criticizing the Marxist left-wing idea of history, but still making some arguments about remarkable developments of that period. The basic idea was that idea of a transcendent world. Before this axial revolution, according to this understanding, religion was part of life, part of people's lives. There was no separate one God, and there was no separate paradise, separate other world was not there. Religion was not articulated. It was assimilated into articulated separately. It was part of the people's lives. It could not be identified as religion, even though now we can distill that as religion. So that changed through these axial revolutions. The idea of a other world, paralokik dunya, idea of transcendent world was brought in, and proposal to reorganize the prophetic, religious, and philosophical proposal to reorganize the mundane world, this world, so that it comes to resemble or imitates the transcendental world, the paralokik dunya. That was the basic idea. Now, there is something, I am not a votary of Weber or axial revolution as such, but I try to learn from every idea which tries to grapple with some large scale historical phenomenon. So I do use in my arguments, the importance of identifying axial age and axial revolution. And to me, it also sounds that modernity, which starts in 16th, 17th century Europe, that resembles the axial revolution of a different kind. Here, if the abstract idea of the axial revolution 2,500 years ago was the transcendental world, was the large religion, was the prophets, was the elite, that that propounded philosophy of life for the people below, and wanted to reorganize the society through transcendent idea of transcendental world. In modernity, that role is played by scientific revolution. That to me is core. I don't have time to make that argument, but I can talk more on another occasion about this. Scientific revolution is the core of philosophical modernity, which includes enlightenment and modern ideologies and philosophy. So the role that transcendental world played in axial revolutions of earlier era, the same role scientific revolution plays in modernity. This does not mean that the social life and social world has to imitate nature. That kind of vulgar scientific ideas have been there, but I don't mean that. That is vulgarization of scientific revolution. Scientific revolution gives rise to a hidden approach, a hidden attitude to the world and hence to society itself. So it does not conceptualize society in the image of nature, in the image of science. It does not imitate, social science should not imitate natural science, but there is something deeper in the methodology and in the philosophy that humanity comes to acquire through scientific revolution, which forms the core of this second axial revolution, which is modern revolution. So universality of the scientific, the natural, and the objective replaces the universality of the transcendental world of the first axial age. So this, and I am bringing this, why I am bringing this here is that Bhakti era appears to me to be largely counter-axial. It is a movement from below. It is populist. It does not have any universal, idea, because universal idea of transcendent was already there in axial revolution, and universal idea of scientific, is very different from what Bhakti would believe in, And the way we have talked about Bhakti, and in discussion I could elaborate more on that if you ask or if needed, that Bhakti era for me is counter-axial. Of course, my inclination is towards modernity, and hence I am also inclined towards axial revolutions. Not that they can be reinvented, but the only way in today's time is to learn the positives from axial revolution is to have modernity. And Bhakti is counter, even though many theorists have argued that Bhakti in its essence was modern, because it proposed individuals' road to God. It gave rights to the individual, no matter which caste that individual came from, no matter which gender that individual came from, the right to access God. So many people have interpreted Bhakti as modern, but I disagree with that. For me, Bhakti in its larger makeup is counter-axial, and hence its legacy must be overcome in the long run. This has the implication for fixing and fine-tuning we coming from left, our ideological, political, and cultural attitudes. So that is where I will end. Thank you. I'm sorry that again I have taken more time than I planned.